to go well. Do you agree with people who hold that broadly gender is a social construct?
No.
Can
I
you
don't
just
hold with those
explain
people at all.
why? Yes.
Well, because first of all, that's an axiomatic pronouncement rather than a consequence of the analysis of the empirical data. And I mean, what do you mean a social construct? Genitalia aren't a social construct. Differences in height aren't a social construct. Differences in weight aren't a social construct.
What we deduce from our genitalia is to an extent constructed, right?
Well, because there's environmental and cultural effects on anything that's complex, and that's certainly the case. And differentiating what those are is a very difficult thing to do. But the psychometric work on that has already been done and done well. And when I...
What do you mean by the psychometric work?
I mean, psychologists in particular have spent 40 years sorting out an empirically derived model of personality. That's the Big Five model, which is well accepted among personality psychologists in the mainstream, most of who lean left, by the way, by an overwhelming majority. So there's no right-wing
It's a taxonomy, right? It might be five,
it's
might be six. I mean, they could be wrong.
Yeah, but one of the things that's interesting about the taxonomy is that it was atheoretically derived. It's purely a consequence of statistical analysis. And so
I'm not sure where that's taking us on how far gender is socially constructed.
Okay, so the first thing to do is to figure out what the parameters are when you talk about something like gender. So the parameters are, say, parameters of temperament, because you said, well, we're not going to talk about the biology, we're going to talk about what's derived from that. So we might say temperament. Okay, so we know the temperamental dimensions. We know that they differ between men and women, and they differ cross-culturally. But more importantly, this is the crucial distinction.
Well, we don't know, because, I'm just looking at a piece of recent research on the brain, which concludes there are not two types of brain, and there are other researchers.
Who did the research?
No, it's the New Scientist. Scans prove there's no such thing as the male or female brain, just so you know what you're dealing with.
Nobody who has any sense would ever claim that there was a male and female brain.
Okay.
These differences aren't absolute.
But do you want to, so shall we just take that as a question? Do you want to engage that question on two types of brain, and then we can be a bit clearer on the question?
Well, there aren't two types of brain, and men and women are more the same by personality than they are different by a substantial margin. There's more similarity than difference.
If there's more similarity than difference.
But that doesn't mean the differences are irrelevant. So let me give you an example. Right. So if you pick two people at random out of the population and had to guess who was more aggressive, and you guessed the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. That's about the magnitude of the difference between men and women.
Well, that's 60-40. It's not that much of a margin,
right.
is it?
That's exactly right. But, and this is where things get more sophisticated. All right, so then imagine that you had to pick the 1 in 100 most aggressive person and put them in jail, which is what we do. They're all men. So even though at the midpoint, the difference between men and women isn't that extreme, at the extremes, the difference is extraordinary. And most of the activity, or much of the activity in complex situations, happens at the extremes. So men are more interested in things than women are, and women are more interested in people than men are, on average. And those differences are largest in Scandinavia, by the way. So there's no evidence that they're socioculturally constructed. And one of the consequences of that is that if you leave men and women to make free choices...
Well, let's put aside that Scandinavia is not just one country, and it has lots of different political differences within
Sure, but the
Scandinavia,
point is that, and this is the fundamental point, is that the more egalitarian the country, the bigger the differences between men and women. The bigger.
I have no idea how one could possibly
conclude
that.
You rank order countries by their sociocultural policies, from egalitarian to non-egalitarian, and then you look at the magnitude of the differences in temperament in men and women in those countries. And you do those analyses
depending on your definition
them.
of temperament.
Yeah, but there isn't a definition of temperament that exists that's valid outside of the psychometric community.
Well,
and so this is well-established
science. We're locked into a particular definition within what you call the psychometric community. And other people may simply say, look, I experience the world very differently, and I have evidence from my dealings, whether I'm a man, whether I'm a woman, whether I'm looking at how we get along together and what we do to improve matters, that doesn't conform to that. I mean,
the question is then, what is the evidence? The fact that someone has an opinion about it isn't relevant. The relevant issue is what the evidence suggests, unless you're willing to throw out the scientific enterprise, which I wouldn't recommend.
No, I'm not. I'm certainly not doing that. But I do think that to pin it to a narrow definition of psychometric testing
it's not narrow. It's 5-dimensional. It's 5-dimensional. It's not narrow. The whole world only has 4 dimensions. 5-dimensional model is actually extraordinarily sophisticated.
If it's got 4 dimensions and then we're into 5, that's magic.
Well, you have 5 dimensions. There's many multidimensional spaces, but reality itself has 4 dimensions, and there's plenty of complexity in
Let's
that.
come back to your evidence. Absolutely come back to evidence, but also to what you make of the evidence, because trading.
Well, all I make of the evidence is that there's multiple reasons for gender differences.
So what do we then do with this? Let's say that we decide that there are differences, and we can argue whether it's about the average. I mean, who is the average woman? Am I the average woman? Are you the
Well,
average
in
man?
some ways, probably. In other ways, not.
Right. Okay. Good to know.